This is Dr. Carroll with another video. Today's video is about preprocessor directives. You can also think of them as macros that we're going to expand and include. What the preprocessor does is before the code is compiled, the preprocessor makes a pass and resolves the macro definitions. So let's talk about one that surely you're familiar with, pound include. What it does is the preprocessor replaces the pound include line with the contents of the file. For example, if we have pound include and then file name, it will replace this line with the contents that are in file name, all of the contents. It goes and basically it copies and pastes them there. So you've probably seen the pound include line with the angle brackets, and alternatively there's pound include with quote marks. The difference is the directories of which the compiler is going to look for the file name. With the quotes, the compiler is going to look first in the current directory or those before it looks in the include directories, as opposed to here it's just going to look in the include directories. Let's talk about pound define. Let's start with an example. So here's a macro, and what it is, pound define says I'm going to define this, and so we're going to define pi as a macro, and what we do is we define it to be 3.14. We could do 3.1459 or whatever it is. Now we can use pi in our code, and before it's compiled, pi will be expanded to 3.14. Okay, and so let's look at another definition. Let's say we're doing a lot of crazy geometry and we recognize that we needed one more than pi, just as an example. So let's see what that would look like. Okay, so let's say we used it later on in the code, like x equals pi plus 1 times 5. Now we need to be careful here, because what's going to happen is this is going to be replaced by what's to the right here. So if we just copy paste that, that's the same as putting in parentheses here, and that's not good. That just changed what we wanted. Not what we want. So to fix this, we need to make sure we put parentheses around it. Now with parentheses, it'll resolve to that, and then we're good. Okay, so make sure you put parentheses around it. So let's talk about what the syntax is. The syntax for pound define is you have the macro name, and the general coding convention is that macros have all uppercase letters. And then you could actually provide it arguments. You could provide it multiple arguments. So if you're going to provide the arguments, provide the parentheses around it. And then you provide the code that it's going to expand to. Let's see an example of this with multiple arguments. So you could have mult, short for multiply, and pass in 2 arguments, which will expand to x times y. Just an example. Okay, let's look at a more realistic example or more useful example. For example, you want to do pound define max, and it's going to take 2 arguments, a and b, and you're going to expand that to be if a is less than b using the conditional operator, then return b, otherwise return a. Great. One gotcha here. Let's look at this. So if we define, if we have this code where we have defined x and y and z is going to get the result of max, and we have x plus plus and y plus plus, well then the problem is when we expand that, it's going to look like this, because we take x plus plus and we replace it. This is before it's compiled, so we replace all instances of a with what is here. Well, that's not going to be what we want, so not what we want. Same as, okay? So we need to be careful about that. Pound defines are useful to create code that is more readable and allows you to use macro names to expand and interesting conventions. There's a lot more complexity that you can provide with that, but we'll just leave it at that for today. You can also have undef and then a macro name, which is going to undefine a macro, or it removes a macro. Okay, now let's talk about conditional inclusions. So these are useful to include the contents of a file once and only once. Okay, it's necessary if you have code that uses class A and class B, where class B ends up using class A. So you'd need to, for example, if you had a linked list class, the data object would be of type class A, but we need to include the data object and we need to include class B, which would be the list. But the list is going to end up including the data object because that's what it holds. So we need to guard against that. You'll know that this is necessary if the compiler is complaining that something is being redefined, for example. So what this would look like in code is, the way to do this is if this is not defined, and we just come up with this, and a convention is to use the file name, all uppercase. For larger projects, you could use the project underscore the path underscore the file name to make sure it's unique, because this can't apply anywhere else. And so if this is not defined, then the very next thing we do is we define it. And that way the preprocessor has it defined and will never include the contents of the file again. So we could put this on the very edges of our code, the very beginning, and then end the if at the very end. This is similar but slightly different than using pragma once, because pragmas are machine or operating system specific by definition and therefore are less portable. That's it.